So today on the podcast, I'm sat here to go and speak to Rosie. Rosie, I came across from the Birth Tear Support Facebook group that she set up. So I'm going to speak to Rosie about this. And Rosie is a mum to two little girls, but you can correct. Yep, she's nodding. Yep, two little girls. And is also, we were just discussing how I pronounce this, a naturopath as well. So we're going to talk lots about kind of nutrition and the effect it can have on your postnatal recovery. Rosie, is there anything you want to add to that introduction?
Yeah, that sounds about right. Thank you,
Yeah.
Natalie, for having me.
You're
I'm really pleased to be here to talk about this.
good. I'm so pleased that we can do this. And it feels for me like such a what's the word, like almost like a full circle, because obviously I found your birth tear support group when I had my 3rd-degree tear, and it was so helpful. And so to now be in a place where I am about to have my 3rd child, but I've also started this podcast and be able to speak to you feels like a wonderful kind of full circle that I've gone the whole way round. So should we maybe jump straight into the birth tear support group that you started?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, it's amazing that it's grown. I never looking back because it's a long time ago now. So my firstborn just turned 8.
Oh, wow.
And looking back, it's one of those times a funny thing, isn't it? Because it seems like a million years ago, but equally some memories are just like yesterday. But yeah, I started the group because I had nowhere to turn to, and I guess because of my profession, I want to help people. And I guess once I came out of that initial fog, baby blues or whatever you want to call it, I then kind of thought, well, actually, I want to set something up to help others as well, because this is really hard and really lonely. So I just turned to Facebook because that seemed like the easiest thing to do, I guess, at the time, and set up a group. Just I think it was 2016, so I must have been like 6 months postpartum or something. And I just set up, and I found actually um, the internet was very much a pivotal kind of, not a pivotal, but like a clutch that I used early on, and in a good way and a bad way actually. I often talk about Dr. Google being not very helpful most of the time, but there were some pockets of positivity on the internet. And so I decided to make a place where it was specific for birth tears. So I set up birth tear support, is what I called it. I think I had a different name originally, but there was already one set up for 4th-degree tears, I think. So I set one up for sort of 3rd and 4th-degree tears, and it morphed over time, and it's now for complicated 2nd-degree tears because they can be just as damaging in some ways, and 3rd and 4th-degree tears. And I think I've just got over 5,000 members now, which is mad. But yeah, it's a great place for women all around the world to share their stories in private and in confidence with other mums that really understand.
You've definitely got 5,000 followers, because I actually went on there the other day just to have a little look. I often click back in and just see if there's anything I can help with, because I know a lot of women like to go on there and kind of leave a question, so if they've just had a 3rd-degree tear, or I think a common one seems to be if they're having a 2nd child
Yeah.
and they've had a tear, and then they're asking for women's experience as to whether you've had another vaginal birth or if you had an elective C-section. So I do pop back in quite a lot just to see if I can kind of give any advice. It's definitely grown, and it's definitely such a good resource. And like I said, it was so helpful for me. Are you happy to talk a little bit about your experience in terms of actually the birth and then setting it up? I believe you had a 3rd-degree tear, did you?
Yeah, actually, because obviously we were planning to do this podcast, I went back and I've written 2 birth stories. One of them's a private one that I just had on my computer, which I hadn't actually opened up since 2016 when I wrote it.
Wow. Okay.
And then I wrote one in 2020, so post my 2nd birth,
Okay.
in a much more kind of therapeutic, helpful perspective. And
Yeah.
actually, I wrote something down here which I thought I'd share now. So this is what I wrote in 2016, and it was the end of the birth story.
Okay.
Just a couple of sentences. It says, "The midwives stressed me and made me do things I never wanted to. The most surprising thing was that I never thought I'd feel so vulnerable during labour and would need my hand held, but I did. and yet no one did hold my hand, and I didn't ask them to. Now I feel angry that my future pregnancies and births are jeopardized from my injuries. So that was kind of how I felt at the end. And reading it back, there was so much anger and fear, I guess, even though I was out of that initial sort of, I'd say the first 3 or 4 months was really hard. But I think looking back, that just shows there was still that sort of anger and confusion. Because I think a first time birth for a mum is like massive, whatever outcome you have, even if you have the perfect birth, it's still, you're a mum for the first time. It's a rite of passage. You can't really explain it to anybody. And you throw in an actual bit of trauma or injury, it's really difficult, isn't it? But in terms of my first birth, I guess I was an unusual case, I think, because I was young, so I fell pregnant at 23.
Okay.
And
you were young, yeah.
Yeah, and because I was diagnosed with PCOS when I was 20,
Okay.
and I met my now husband around then, and we kind of just thought, he's a bit older than me. We kind of thought we're never going to be together. It might take me like 5 years or something to conceive. We don't know. So let's just see what happens. But it was like 4 months later. So it was all a lot earlier than we thought. But, and my pregnancy was really smooth, a bit of sickness at the beginning, like most people. And because of my, I'm a naturopath and nutritional therapist. At the time, actually, I was just graduating. So I was just finishing up when I was pregnant. So I was really keen on doing everything as natural as possible. I did the pregnancy yoga. I did the perineal stretching.
Okay.
I knew about tears. I knew about severe tears. But looking back, I think there was a naivety around it, almost like not cocky, but I think I had so much faith in nature and that women are supposed to be able to birth. I was in that kind of, I still think it's there actually. There is a bit of a group of practitioners / women that still kind of think every birth can possibly be amazing. But I think we have to remember, that even hundreds and thousands of years ago, mums still died during childbirth, even if it was in a completely safe environment. Do you know what I mean? So it happens. Yes, there's risks. Yeah. There's always risks. And I think I was in this bit of a bubble, and looking back anyway. So I did all the right things and had reflexology, and I went to 41 weeks, I think it was, and they were talking about wanting to do a sweep and things. Yeah. And I was like, no, it'll be fine. And my acupuncturist, I saw her, and the next day, that night, my contraction started, and it was like, standard in the middle of the night. Got up, had breakfast, I was okay. And I actually had planned an NHS home birth.
Okay.
Which again, with hindsight, which is a great thing, got a little bit pushed into actually. Because where I live, when you fall pregnant, you have to self-refer yourself to the maternity hospital.
Right.
And there's a little tick box online that says, where do you want to birth? Bearing in mind I'm 23, no idea about anything about birth. I just put, I don't know. Because it gave you an option of like home birth, midwife suite, central delivery suite. I said, I don't know. So the next thing I know, like a few days later, I get called by the NHS home birth team. And they're kind of very friendly, and they're like giving me all the statistics of if you give birth in hospital, you have this chance of having a C-section. It was a little bit kind of pushy, I'd say. And I went along and met them. They had like an open evening, and I thought, my husband was a little bit more worried and concerned.
Rosie, sorry, the connection just broke up then, so it's going a little bit. Are you okay just to go back? So you just said the home birth team rang you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, okay. The home birth team rang me, and they were kind of a little bit pushy. They were giving me statistics of if you give birth in hospital, you have a higher chance of complications. As in medical intervention.
Yes,
sorry, not complications. And I went along to that open evening, and it sounded really good. And my husband was a little bit more like, you sure? And the grandparents were kind of like, it's a risk. So fast forward to when I was in labour, I called my midwife team, the midwife I'd seen all through pregnancy, because the one thing for me was that continuity of care.
Yes, that's what a lot of people spoke about. Yeah.
Because I'm someone that has to really trust someone. Now, unfortunately, the day I went to labour, my midwife was on another birth. So I didn't see her the whole time of my labour, which was about, wasn't actually that long. It was about 20 hours. So I had these other people I'd never met, and I didn't really like them. So that's the whole thing already. Looking back, was, when we understand about stress and how that makes everything worse for the birth process.
And that needing to feel safe, isn't it?
Yeah,
Really
and they were quite. I mean, I have these little snippets of memories. Obviously, I try and kind of not open that book very often, but I will today. So who knows what will come out. But yeah, I was. They were quite insistent on internal examinations, which I found. I remember lying on my sofa and I found them extremely painful. So I think what I underestimated was the pain, actually.
Yeah.
And again, looking back in hindsight, if you fast forward to postpartum when I had physio care, I was diagnosed with hypertonic pelvic floor, which they believe I had lifelong. So looking back, that pain I was having was probably my hypertonic pelvic floor.
Yeah.
And probably potentially why I tore, actually. But yeah, I just remember being in so much, the pain was like a stabbing in my cervix. And even the midwife was like, you're having quite strong contractions. And towards the end, they were really long and really strong and really frequent. And that went on for hours. And my waters didn't break, so they were pushing on my cervix, which made it really painful. But the dilation actually happened reasonably quick for a first-time birth. And it got until my waters broke last minute. Yeah, I'm trying to remember which order it was. They were concerned because my temperature went up by 0.5 degree, not very much. And my naturopathic mind was going, well, it's probably because I'm dehydrated. Because I couldn't drink without vomiting. If I was in hospital, they probably would have put me on a drip, I reckon. But I really struggled to get anything down because of the pain. So they called the ambulance, and this was like 10 p.m., 11 p.m. They called the ambulance because she wasn't seemed to be coming. And then my waters broke as soon as the ambulance got there. And everything changed then. I remember this was where it all went pitong, really, because I had these men in my house, these paramedics in my kitchen. I could hear them stomping around like low voices, The midwife changed. Suddenly went from being all kind of nice and caring to kind of like, right, I'm going to be a mean midwife now and you're going to get this baby out.
Oh,
so
God.
The whole tone changed, and that obviously made me tighter.
Yeah, of course.
Cortisol went up. And she wouldn't come out. They could see her head, but she wasn't coming out. So like half an hour later, let's get into the ambulance, with her in my like vaginal canal, basically.
Yeah.
And as soon as I walked outside, I felt her coming out. I was like, she's coming out. She's like, they're like, you have to go now, because they were worried about, because when my waters broke, there was meconium in them. And they were worried about aspiration. So when I got into the ambulance, I had then hold her in for the 20-minute journey to hospital.
Oh my goodness,
and
Rosie.
So I think obviously mums who've given birth will know how hard that is. But for those that haven't, I always describe it as trying to hold in diarrhea or something.
Yeah.
It's a compulsion. it's really hard, but I did it. And by the time I got to I just remember having this image of being put on a bed and pushed through the maternity unit, and I was screaming. I don't know why. I think I was just out of frustration more than anything.
Yeah.
And I remember all these young midwives just looking at me like I was insane. I just remember this image of these faces looking at me. And I got into the central delivery suite. I got into a room with a different midwife. And she said, I remember just my natural instinct was to get up on the bed. The back was inclined, and I kind of I was on my knees, put my hands up the top of where the shoulders go. So I was inclined on my all fours. And she said to me, Julie said to me, can you go on your back? And I said, and I'm 22 hours into this, how exhausted you are. I said, I said, why? She said, we need to monitor you. And I was like, nothing's going wrong here. Like, what's happening? And I was just so exhausted. I just did what she said, which is one of my biggest regrets, actually. And I went on my back, and she actually, within about 5 minutes, I got her out. And actually it all seemed fine. The head came out fine. I was told to wait. Next contraction, I pushed her out. Perfect APGAR score. It was all okay. Midwives went off. Then the one midwife was waiting for the afterbirth, and it all seemed fine. But then she was concerned, and I could tell she was a bit concerned. So I was bleeding.
Okay, yeah.
And she gave me what they give you to stop, I can't remember what it's called now, the hormone to stop you bleeding, and then
Yeah.
it kept bleeding, not crazy profusely, but enough for her to be concerned. So she said, I'm going to get the doctor in just to check you. I think I'm not sure what's causing the bleed. And I was just thinking, oh God, I got a hemorrhage or something. And then she came in and they gave me some gas and air, and she basically gave me a rectal check, which I'm really grateful for, actually. Really
I was going to
grateful for.
say, yeah, because so many people don't get that. And I know it's something that a lot of women think, you've just given birth, like the last thing you want is literally someone's finger in your bottom. But actually, probably me and the research shows that if you get a rectal exam, it's so much better because you can catch so much more of the tear, or if it's gone into a fistula. So, and actually going back, I know it's not that long, but 8 years, I feel like that's quite advanced that they did that. So it
No, I'm really
seems...
do you know what? I'm a big advocate of having the anal check
Yes.
and I talk about it openly because I think and I'm sure you'll agree, the biggest issue we get from severe tears is when they're missed.
Yeah, completely. Yeah.
And they are missed, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But the one way to not miss them is to have that check done.
Yeah.
So I had it checked, and they said, yeah. And actually, they thought it was worse than it was. She said, "Oh, I think this is a 4th degree tear."
Oh gosh.
And
Okay.
I knew what that was. So then I went from kind of like elation, having a baby, it's done, to then utter dread.
Yeah, of course.
And shock. And the next thing I know, the anaesthetist's in there. And I've never had any hospital care in my life. Like, so this is all new to me. Like, some people have had operations before. I've had nothing. So, anaesthetist there. What, do you want to sign all this? And I'm like, I don't know, just whatever you think's best, I'll sign. And then I'm whipped upstairs, and this is like 3 a.m. now. And I remember lying down. I mean, I remember actually sitting. Having to sit was the hardest thing because I was sitting. And by this time, the pain was kicking in because,
yeah, of course,
obviously, when everything's stretched, you kind of numbed a bit, aren't you? But it was all sort of, all the pain all the nerves were kind of coming back, and I had to sit on my tear. It was awful, and have the spinal done. And then once I was lying down, I had like 4 doctors trying to stitch me up, and I actually remember feeling reasonably chilled at this point. And I think because the radio was on, they seemed quite chilled. They knew what they were doing. And then the doctor came up to me, kind of pulled her face mask down, and said, "Your tear's a bit trickier than we thought, so we're going to have to call in the consultant. He's at home."
God.
On call. So I have to wait 20 minutes or something. He arrives, and he was amazing, actually. And I'm glad that they got the best guy in to do it. So, and actually I did have a really good repair after all that. But I just remember lying in at the what do they call it now? The ward you kind of are in for an hour while they watch you after an operation.
Recovery. Is it recovery ward? Yeah.
Yeah. And this sticks out to me. So I got given by the midwife that delivered me. She seemed a bit in shock too, actually. And actually later on I learned that was her first severe tear that she got under her care. Okay. She wasn't young though, so maybe it doesn't happen very often in that hospital, I don't know. But she came up to me with an A4 like NHS printout on perineal tears, and she just said, all she said to me was, "I'm really sorry, but 60% of women after a severe tear by 12 months will feel back to normal." And I remember thinking, that's really bad. It's a really bad statistic. I was like, what about the 40%? And
yes,
12 months?
Yeah, it's a long time.
So I remember thinking, is that it? And there was no aftercare advice, apart from I think, I don't know, lying down or, not straining, but that was it. That was all I was given. And it was from there on, it was just devastation really for the next few months. And when the baby blues kick in and your milk kicks in like a few days later, that kind of my mood went straight. And actually in hindsight, I probably did have postpartum depression, but I managed to kind of come out of that myself. And I've written a whole blog post on my healing journey because there was so much involved in physically and mentally, and what helped me with that. And part of it was cathartic to start the birth care group, and I'm not going to lie, I'll be honest and say part of that was for me as well,
of course,
as other mums. And yeah, I mean that group's amazing now because it's pretty much self-sufficient, because obviously I can't check 50 posts a day, but if someone I have strict entry, so people have to answer questions so I know they're legit. But if someone does something wrong, people will flag it up. So the mums on there are amazing, and I'll just like either talk to them or block them if it's a spam or something. So yeah.
And so just like I'm trying to process everything from the birth and the tear. So how did the tear affect you mentally and physically in that postnatal period? So kind of what symptoms did you have emotionally and physically from the tear?
Physically, I had a lot of heaviness is probably the main one, actually. So that's a bit I haven't actually brought up was so about 2 or 3 weeks, there was this window where I started to feel a bit better, as in the pain, feeling like I could actually walk. Because I remember I couldn't walk anywhere. Like I remember walking to the lamp post outside our house, which was probably about 15 meters, and I did that 7 days postpartum. And I remember, I could barely walk before then. I couldn't even walk up and down the stairs. And so heaviness was a big one. And because I've always been so fit and able, it was a real shock to me. Like I just felt like I'd been hit by a truck,
Yeah.
So I'd never been like that before. So it was a real shock to feel that way. But there was a little window. I was starting to feel a bit better. And then I had this real heaviness. And that's when I went to the GP, and she said, yeah, you've probably got a prolapse. But she was a very blasé about it. I mean, she was really kind and sympathetic, but she said to me, it's very common at this stage, because it is at 2 weeks postpartum.
Yeah.
And she said, let's just see how you get on. But me being an anxious type, I didn't know then I was an anxious type, but looking back, I am a bit of an anxious type. I then went to Dr. Google, and that really did not help. I think that'd be one of my biggest pieces of advice. And I say this to clients for nutritional therapy, not even about birth necessarily, but just don't use Google for health related things. And I'm sure doctors would agree with me on that one. But I just went down a real rabbit hole. And my husband would attest to that, because he would be like, get off your phone, what are you reading? And I'd be reading about rectovaginal fistulas. I'd be reading about people that, all the worst case scenarios, basically. Yeah. And it was just not helping my mental health. And I think if that happened to me 20 years ago and phones weren't around, I probably would have been a bit more naive to it, and potentially that would have helped in the short term.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the internet's double-edged sword, isn't it?
It's completely, yes. Because I feel the same. Like when I had my prolapse, I went down a massive Google spiral, and it was horrendous. And you do get absolute worst case scenarios, and it's very depressing. But on the flip side, you've got your birth tear support group that you find on Facebook, and nowadays you've got Instagram, where there's like a massive support community for anyone that's got severe tears and prolapse, and really good information. But I say it to all my clients as well. I say, just don't Google prolapse. Like, whatever you do, don't put those words into Google. Don't spiral downwards. Just step away. So it's a very difficult one, because you're searching for information, you're searching for answers. I think you're searching for trying to find other people that have got the same thing. So you want to connect, but at the same time, those connections can make it worse. And that kind of, I don't want to say information, because half the time it's not good information, but you're searching for something, and it's like Alice in Wonderland, isn't it? Going down and down darker into that hole.
So that was, I mean, that was one of the reasons why I ended up making the group, because I wanted somewhere that was good information. I wouldn't say it's misinformation, but people do generally go onto the internet to vent.
Yes.
And so you will find worst case scenarios, and some people are living those lives, and that's really sad and really difficult for a lot of people. I was one of the lucky ones who, eventually I wouldn't say I'm 100%. Like, there's definitely injuries are injuries. They'll always be there. There'll always be things that I have to do to manage it. And sometimes that sneaks up on me, and I get a little bit down about it. And I know a lot of people feel the same way, and they worry about the future and what that means post menopause and things like that. But I try not to think about it. And I know from nutritional therapy and naturopathy that there's a hell of a lot we can do to aid the body and heal the body. So you have to remember that, and kind of have that positive mentality that, okay, things tissue integrity does decline with age, but there's a lot we can do to help that and buffer
Yeah.
that.
And what did you do then? So what did you do with your knowledge to kind of heal the third degree tear in the tissue? Did you use nutrition, and did you use all of that knowledge that you had to try and heal?
Yeah, definitely. So my issue early on, I mean, one of my biggest issue's always been that sluggish bowel. And
Okay.
so when I had the tear, that obviously was a real concern. And then with the prolapse, you don't want to
Yeah.
have to ever push or
No.
strain. So my biggest thing was avoiding constipation, which I've always been a bit prone to. So I did take a good dose of magnesium, and I think early on psyllium husk actually I took early
Okay.
on for a good while. There's a good product that used to be about that kind of combined different herbs and things for fibre, but it doesn't exist anymore actually. But I took that for a long time, and the squatty potty, which I know you're a fan
Yeah.
of. I still do that now. I teach my girls to go using that as well, and I wish I
Yes.
knew that when I was young.
Oh, I wish they would teach it in schools. I mean, I know now they've got the pelvic health that they're starting to roll out, but yeah, I teach my boys the same. They both know to get their feet on it, to move, to poo, to breathe, to relax and everything. But I think, yeah, as soon as you've had a pelvic floor injury, it makes you very adamant that no one else will suffer from one, and especially your own children. You just think, and I think it's so important, isn't it, in childhood, that actually we talk about good bowel habits, and we talk about, your pelvic floor and everything, because I suppose, like, probably both of us, our generation and previous generations, it was so hush hush. Going to the toilet was like quite a secret thing, and even things like, going for an emergency wee before you went out, that we now
Yeah.
know is like not the
Or
best thing to
squatting to
do.
wee.
Yes, yeah. So I feel like there were so many things that weren't great, that now if we can try and educate the next generation, especially girls, I think it's so crucial, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And it isn't until you go through something like this, suddenly people tell you stories, don't they? And
Yeah.
obviously I won't say names because this is going to go public, but even in my family, there were stories that cropped up, and I thought, well, you could have told me already, but you
Yeah.
don't want to tell people. There's quite often this, I think it's false, to be honest, because in my Facebook group, the amount of times I've read "if I knew,"
Oh,
"if only
yeah.
I
If
knew,"
only I knew.
and
Yeah.
I'm a massive fan of knowledge is power. Um, but there's also this ignorance is bliss kind of
Yeah.
saying, and I do think that's true as well. So it's a really difficult balance to get, really, without scaring people. But also you want to empower them and give them the knowledge. And I'm not going to lie, it's a difficult balance to do, but I think we have to be realistic about for new mums and new expectant mums about the risks, because, and actually I got quite cross because with my second, when I went in for my pre-op, because I had an elective section,
Oh, you had an
they
elective as
got
well. Okay.
they got me to sign a form, obviously, but one bit really got me actually from the form, because it had a little paragraph on vaginal births, and it said the risks and things of vaginal births, and it said severe tear 1 to 2%, and that's just not true.
No, it's 6%, isn't it? Plus.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because I was a lay representative for the UAC2 project, which has been going on the last few years with the Royal College of Midwives and the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and I was just there as as a mum representative who's had a severe tear, and the statistics are closer to 6 to 8% of first time mums, and so that annoyed me a bit. Actually, well, it got me quite cross. I was actually going to write to the hospital, which I probably should do still, just to update that.
Yeah, definitely.
Because we need to know and have the statistics right for people to make informed choices.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, tears are increasing, and they think it's a mixture of diagnosis is getting better, but they do actually think the occurrence is increasing too.
Yeah, I agree. I just want to go back to something you just said then. Oh, about choosing a planned C-section, just because obviously I chose a planned C-section as well for the second, and I've got one next week for the third one. But it's probably one of the questions I get asked the most is, how after third degree tear prolapse did you choose to have a vaginal birth or planned C-section? So would you talk a little bit about how you made that choice? Because I think so many people are interested in that decision.
Yeah, it's the biggest question that comes up in the group, I think. It was really hard, I'm not going to lie. It was a really tough decision. I give the same advice as what I'd give a client. And my approach to nutritional therapy actually is it's very personalised. You have to look at all the risk factors for that person, what they went through the first time, why they went through what they went through, what caused them to have medical intervention or what caused them to have a tear. Can that be changed in the next birth? And what injuries have they got and what symptoms have they got currently, and there's so many factors. I got different opinions from lots of different people. The first thing I did actually was request for my GP to have a gynae appointment.
Okay.
Because and actually this is something my mum recommended, because maternity care has changed massively over the years, so I'm sure as you're aware. And my mum was shocked that we never had a pelvic examination antenatally, prenatally. And she said, "Oh, that was normal back in the 80s or the 70s." And I guess they stopped that because they thought it was unnecessary, but maybe it wasn't.
Well, going back to the whole hypertonic pelvic floor, because I think, if for me, that's a really big thing. If you can have a physio appointment before you give birth, you can find out if you've got a hypertonic pelvic floor. And exactly as you said, if you have, fine, you can either work with the physio to work how to release it during birth and learn the correct techniques, or you decide that actually you can't release it before the birth and therefore you have a planned C-section, because trying to give birth with a hypertonic pelvic floor, exactly, you're much more likely to have an instrumental birth with severe tears. So I think women would benefit so much, but obviously the whole prenatal, postnatal in the UK, I mean, it's so underfunded and there's so much that needs doing. I feel like that's probably the last thing that will ever occur, but it would be fantastic just to have one appointment. Yeah,
it would be amazing. That's the ideal. And in France, I think they have postnatal physio, don't they?
Yeah.
An assessment of pelvic. Yeah. So basically, I contacted my the GP put me through to a gynae here where I am. And actually, by the time I turned up, because I requested this before, while I was trying to conceive my second, hopefully before I fell pregnant. But actually, by the time I saw her, I was about 6 weeks pregnant.
Okay.
And she said to me, actually, it was a really nice appointment because I'd never seen a gynae before, as in like an appointment with a gynae. And she said, the first thing she said to me was, I just want to say, well done for birthing a 9.5-pound baby. And actually, that was really nice to hear.
Yeah.
It was actually quite, I really felt that. And it was really nice to hear someone say kind of like, it was hard and you did really well, and a pat on the back sort of thing. So that was nice of her to say. And when she examined me, she actually said, because I asked her straight, I said, what do you recommend? What do you think I should do? And she said, well, you've healed well, but my concern is you've got a short perineum.
Right, yes.
And I had no idea that was a thing.
Yeah.
But that makes sense. But I didn't really know that they varied in size. So I asked her, I said, okay, what's the average length of a perineum? For those listening who don't know what that is, it's the area between your vagina and your anus. And the average length is about 3 centimetres. I had no clue about this.
Well, no one tells you. And again, it's never brought up, is it? And again, it's another check that they could also do whilst pregnant.
Totally.
Again, to say, potentially you've got a shorter one, therefore you might be more likely to tear him. But again, it's not done. But yes, of course you wouldn't have known.
So it was short. And she said, "Oh, it's probably tears can make it shorter." And I said, "No, I think it's always been quite short, but I didn't know that was not unusual, not unusual, but not the average length."
Yeah.
And she said because of that, because you have big babies, she recommended a section.
Okay.
I saw a couple of physios over the years, and they were a bit more like vaginal birth would probably be okay because all that stretching's been done, which is probably true. Because generally second births are better, generally, not always. And so, it was a really hard decision. I didn't really make my decision till probably after the 20-week scan. And I think what did it for me, as well as what the gynae said about my perineum and the weight of my babies, but what really got me was I kind of thought worst case scenario, like if I birthed and then tore again or went through all that again, and I just don't think I could be a good mum to then 2 children to go through all that. So I just felt like people have sections every day. The risks are quite low. I didn't look up the actual risks at the time, and I just thought I just want controlled damage, I think was probably what was going through my head, rather than you never know if the baby's going to have its arm up here.
Yeah.
And then that's all it takes.
Yeah.
You know? So, yeah. And there are some people that have joined our group that had okay births first time, then tore severely in their second birth. So it does happen. It's unusual, but it does happen. And looking back, do I regret it? I don't regret it. I do sometimes wonder, and I go, and actually my youngest daughter, she's a different shape to her sister. She's narrower. So
Okay.
I do think, part of me does think,
easier.
I think a part of me thinks it probably would have been all right, but you just don't know how they come out, do you?
It's the one thing you can't control. You cannot control birth. Yeah.
I mean, my grandma's a good example. So she had 5 children.
Oh, wow.
And her hardest birth was the youngest. And I know some people argue, and I've read this around physiotherapy, that it's because when your core muscles are so relaxed that doesn't actually put the baby in the right position, which is interesting, actually.
Okay.
Because obviously 5th baby, more relaxed abdominals, and he came out proper breech. And she had to birth him breech, and she said it was so hard, and she thought he was going to kill her, you know. But luckily, it was a 5th baby in a way, not a first baby.
Yeah.
And that was in the 60s. But yeah, it made me think, like, well, you just never know, do you? So yeah, I'm glad, and it actually went really smoothly. I was nervous. I was definitely nervous about having like a needle in my spine again. That was my main thing I was worried about, actually. And I tried to make it as natural as possible as well. And where I am in Poole, they were really good. So brilliant. I requested immediate skin on skin as soon as possible, which they did. I also requested to have my so you get given IV antibiotics.
Yeah.
As I'm sure you know, for the C-section. And I request usually, for some reason, they give it to you before the baby's out.
Yeah.
And I asked, could you put it, once she's out, could you put it in after? Because they give you the IV antibiotics to prevent infection in the womb. Yeah. So I thought, what's nothing to do with the baby? I don't want her getting the antibiotics. And, you know, with her microbiome and everything. So they did that, and that was fine. So they were really good. And it was really relaxing and a totally different experience. But again, there's that little niggle that I think, oh, could I have birthed her, you know, and it would have been fine. But I'm happy with the decision, definitely. Yeah. I think it's human nature to kind of wonder sometimes, isn't it?
Oh, completely. And I still to this day, even though I've got my elective C-section booked for next week and I've had, you know, the second one and I loved it, there's still part of me that thinks like, oh, could I have? And I just think as well, and I think similar to you, I was a yoga teacher and I came from that background of thinking I was going to have the most natural birth, and it's all the, you know, the yoga prep and everything. And I think it is very inherent in women to go into birth obviously wanting completely natural. You know, there's not many first-time mums that go in saying, yeah, I definitely want a planned elective C-section. So I think it's almost quite a hard thing to give up in a sense. And I think it can sometimes do like a little bit of a grieving process as well, kind of, because you kind of feel like you've lost an experience you somehow felt, I don't want to say you deserve because that makes it sound wrong, but that you were going to have, and like you did all the right thing. And so I think for a lot of us, there's still definitely that little like bit of doubt, like, well, if I did this differently this time, but again, it's just you're right. I think the one thing with, and I'm going to say natural in this sense because, you know, going into spontaneous natural labour is you cannot plan it, whereas an elective C-section, you really can plan and you can control what's going to happen. And I think for a lot of women, taking back some of that control mentally is quite helpful as well, isn't it? How did it affect your second, like your postnatal recovery then? So how was that postnatal recovery after the C-section?
It was a lot easier. I think as a second time mum, it makes it easier anyway.
Yeah.
you know the drill, right?
Yeah.
You're going to get your milk in, your boobs are going to go massive, you're going to have the baby blues, it's going to be carnage. You've done all that, and that in itself makes it a lot easier. It was painful, like obviously the scar incision, for about 2 or 3 weeks, but I remember by 4 weeks I was like running around town pretty much with a pram, and I couldn't believe it,
Yeah.
because I didn't feel like that with the tear probably until like 3 months or like plus.
Yeah.
So for me, it definitely, I think it affected, in terms of my relationship with my children, I do sometimes wonder how has that affected anything. And I don't know, it does make you think, like in terms of what babies can take in. We don't really know, do we? But I do wonder whether that's affected them. Who knows? Because you kind of have that like I had that kind of immediate bond with my second, but the first it took a few weeks. But I think that's common. But yeah, you asked me earlier about I kind of got sidetracked. But you asked me about what did I do to heal first
Just
time.
because of your expertise. So like, what did you do nutrition wise? What was in your toolbox that you knew to do to kind of help you heal from that trauma?
Well, before I had the tear, I prepared sort of generic tissue healing things, because I knew I was going to have some sort of trauma to my tissues having a birth. So I had my vitamin C ready for tissue health, probiotics.
Okay.
Definitely. I mean, I was taking probiotics all through pregnancy, and there's so much evidence now to show how important that is for the baby's health.
Okay.
And because I had antibiotics for the tear, I took probiotics for a lot. I mean, I generally take probiotics anyway, but I did take a higher dose.
Okay.
And my homeopathy was really helpful, actually. I have a homeopath that I see. I'm not a homeopath, but I have a homeopath I see, and she gave me remedies to help just with the healing of the tissues, which I use both times. But going forward, like past the earlier days of postpartum, kind of looking to heal more the prolapse and the scar tissue, I think I'm a big fan of soft tissue massage. So breaking down scar tissue. So I had to do a lot of that, actually, because another thing that's really common on the group is people saying that sex is painful.
Yeah.
And there's so much scar tissue that occurs. So breaking that down with daily massage was a big one.
Did you see a women's health physio, Rosie, like to get you to do that the first time, or did you just learn it yourself?
I mean, my sister helped me quite a bit. At the time, she was a sports physio. She's actually retrained. She's now a women's health physio.
Oh, wonderful. Another one.
One of the reasons I apparently triggered that with her, because she did help me a bit at the time, as much as she could, 8 years ago. But yeah, there weren't many near me at the time, actually, that were good, because I did see someone, but she was I don't want to poo-poo physios, but you do get really good ones and you get more kind of generic ones. And the person I was recommended was all the way over in Kent, and she was amazing, actually. She really took me under her wing, and I back then, I think maybe because I was young, but I am somebody that needs a lot of encouragement and a lot of reassurance generally in my personal life. And she was a really nice physio, and she was the first one that kind of indicated the hypertonicity. And then I found someone more locally in Southampton, it's about 45 minutes from me. And she was amazing. And she was like game changer for me. And that's when I got my wand, if anyone knows what that is. It's for internal release work, which changed my life.
They are, they're amazing, aren't they?
I remember the first time she gave me treatment with that, I sobbed. I absolutely sobbed. And she recommended a book that was called something about like trauma and heat, and like how your muscles hold trauma. And I've always known that as a naturopath. Like, I'm a big believer in our emotions manifest physically, and we hold trauma in our bodies. And when she first gave me the internal release, it was the same pain I had during labour, right in that cervix, like that stabbing pain that I had. And it just brought everything back, and I just cried. And she was so nice. She just said, just let it out. This is so common. This happens all the time. Trauma. She was so sure. She's like, trauma. Your body knows it. It holds it.
Yeah.
And and I haven't looked back after then, really. I still use it now, like every few weeks, because I still have. I definitely have this pelvic susceptibility, I guess, and I think I probably had it pre pregnancies. But it's just pregnancies made it a lot more tricky. So it's still something I have to navigate. I also did, back in the early days, I also did hyperpressives, which
Oh,
I
you
think,
did as well. Okay. Yeah.
yeah, which are great because diastasis was a big problem for me.
Okay.
I have a real big tummy gap, and actually, it's probably taken me until very recently to close that, especially after a C-section, because that they cut all
Yeah.
through that. They cut through the linea alba, don't they? And so that was a problem for me.
And you found the hyperpressives beneficial for that as well,
yeah,
then? Okay.
definitely for the prolapse, for the tummy gap. And then emotionally, I did have hypnotherapy actually. I'm trying to think when. I think my daughter must have been about 1 when I felt kind of robust enough to
Go
face
through it
that.
all. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was a few hypnotherapy sessions, and it did really just make me kind of put the birth at peace. Just kind of not like suppress it, but I kind of can look at it objectively.
Yeah.
And very rarely does it catch me out. It does sometimes, like completely randomly. And I guess
Yeah.
people say that happens with grief as well, doesn't it? It just
It's
catches you off
triggers,
guard.
isn't it? Yeah, and you just never know what's going to trigger you. And it might seem like a really strange thing, but I'm sure if we kind of analysed it, you could probably find the root of it and think, oh, that's what triggered it. But yeah, it's difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not too bad. I can watch like a birth scene in a movie or something, but it can be just, I don't know. Sometimes when I'm talking about it, someone asks me in like a social place, and it just catches me off guard, and I'm not
Yeah.
prepared, so I can get a bit teary or something. But yeah, it doesn't happen very often. But the hypnotherapy definitely laid all those major kind of anger, guilt, resentment. And actually, I had a really nice moment when I went into hospital for reduced movements, my second, and the midwife that was there was Julie,
Oh,
the one that delivered my
hey, Julie.
first. And I was just looking at her, and she was like, dealing with my tummy.
Yeah.
And it was all fine with the baby. But I said, you probably don't remember me, but I had my first baby with you, and I had quite a bad time. I had a severe tear, and she remembered me.
Oh, wow.
And she went, oh yeah, she said, and she remembered, and she went, do you know what, you're my only severe tear person I've had. And we had this long chat. I can't remember the ins and outs, but I just remember it being really healing and really cathartic to actually see her again. Because
Good. Yeah.
I had held quite a lot of resentment towards her.
Yeah, of course.
I didn't really realise until I saw her actually how much that was still in me. And we had a chat, and she said to me, do you know what, if you were my daughter, I'd say have an election. And so that was another opinion that kind of like, sealed the deal. I had already sort of decided by then, but it kind of put a stamp on it,
Yeah.
But it was nice to see her again and just realise she's just a human
Yeah.
that tried to do her best. And actually, at the end of the day, 99% of healthcare providers are just trying to do their best.
Oh, yeah.
And sometimes they make the wrong call, or it happens. It's not like they're maliciously trying to hurt people. So it was nice to see her again. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting, and I think it's a really good point, because I think, especially at the moment with the NHS under so much strain and maternity services, that it's trying to remember when stuff does go wrong, and at the moment it can go wrong a lot. Yeah, it's not malicious people, but it's more the system and the bureaucracy, and the implementation of kind of the rules at the hospital and what needs to be followed, and the lack of staff. But I think it's very difficult when you've had a traumatic birth and there was a person that played a role in that birth, it's very difficult to not kind of hold them semi-responsible as well, isn't it? But I mean, I think that's wonderful that you were able to actually bump into her and to have that conversation, probably break down a few of those memories maybe from the birth as well.
Yeah. I mean, I've met a few kind of senior midwives over the years, and a lot of them will say that severe tears shouldn't ever happen. They kind of do say it's mismanagement. But then I have heard some people say it sometimes does happen. I think in my case, I got a bit unlucky. I mean, I don't think it helped with the coach pushing, and then holding in, and then having to go on my back.
Yeah.
I think for me, they were the major ones. I do wonder, like, if I was in the midwife suite, who knows? And actually, I think this is why it's really important. I wish, my hope and dreams are to have a better prenatal assessment. So I wish that they kind of did the pelvic examination. Maybe they asked you how much you weighed when you were born.
Yes.
Because I was 3 weeks early and I was 8.5 pounds.
Yeah.
And or ask you how big your husband is. Like, it amazes me that they don't. You know,
Yeah.
I know people that have had real, not necessarily tears, but have had real hard births, and there's like a foot difference between them and their partner.
Yeah.
Why aren't these asked? You know, it's such simple tick box questions.
But I think it's the genetic thing as well that fascinates me, because obviously, again, I was never asked. And then when I look back at my history, I was 10 pounds. My mum was 10 pounds and a half. She was forceps. My nan was forceps. Even, you know, so it's like forceps run in the family because we seem to have big babies. They get stuck. And it's like, actually, had someone discuss that with me, it might have been a bit more of like oh, so maybe forceps might get used during this birth. Okay, here are the risks, like knowing them beforehand, post, you know, rather than being 30 hours into a labour and, you know, signing a waiver to say, okay, fine, do whatever. Yeah, but again, there's just so much that could be done, you know, prenatally.
There are some good things happening though out there. When I went to the OAC2 project launch event, there was a lot of people from around the country that are doing a lot of good work. There's pelvic, there's there's perineal clinics popping up around the country, and even one doctor told me that they're researching a different kind of instrument, which this is really exciting for me.
Yeah.
So they've looked into like basically, like, it's obviously not a plastic bag, but then they're looking at a material that isn't metal,
Right.
so it's not going to have that damage on the tissues, and it's much softer. And so far, it's had a real good success rate. So I'm really pleased to hear that, because, you know, forceps are so medieval almost, aren't they?
So
like, why
medieval, yeah.
Why haven't they got something else now? So I'm glad that's being looked at. And yeah, it's funny. Like, I think it's hard not to kind of look back and go, shoulda, woulda, coulda. But if I could go back, I do wonder whether, and this is funny because from a naturopath saying this, but I do wonder whether, for me, with my hypertonicity, wondering whether if I actually had an epidural, I think actually that has its place sometimes, because what that does is actually relaxes everything. And for me, that could have actually been what I needed.
Yeah.
Because I have that kind of, my muscles are doing this, right? So for something just to relax them actually could have been what I needed. And I'm not advocating it. I'm definitely not advocating it generically, because it does increase the chance of instrumental deliveries and everything. But it just goes to show that everyone is different. And, you know, you can't just say this way of birthing is the way for everyone, which is what I say to everyone about nutrition. There's no one way of eating. You know, everyone's different.
I think maybe that's a really good point to finish up on, is that everyone is different. Every birth is different. Every postnatal recovery is different as well. Going maybe a little bit against that, everyone is different, but is there any advice you would give, generic advice, you know, for women who've had maybe a tear, who are in this postnatal period? Any resources you want to recommend, or anything advice-wise you'd like to give them?
I think avoiding Google.
Yeah.
Asking for help is a massive one. And I think mums and women especially just find that really hard to do. But a lot of people do want to help if you ask them. And I found that when in the older years, when you have older kids and you're struggling a bit, and you say to a mum, actually, can you help? Can you pick up my kids, or could you have them for a play date? And actually, most of the time they're like, yeah, of course, I'll help. And asking for help is a big one, whether it's from a friend, family, or even a healthcare practitioner. Just, I think, patience, having the patience, and this goes across the board for lots of different health problems, but it takes time. You know, we grew a baby for 9 months. We then have to expect at least 9 months recovery, if not longer, if you've had an injury. Well, you know, I didn't feel myself until about 22 months, which is when I decided to start trying for another one. It took that long. So it's really being gentle on yourself, nourishing yourself as well as the baby, you know, having good nutrition, cooking from scratch if you can, asking people to cook you from you. I always say to people, for new mums, I say, don't buy £1,000 pram. Get a second-hand £200 pram. And spend £800 on, you know, decent food or someone to cook for you or
Yeah.
a cleaner, any,
Yes.
that money could go a long way just to, look after yourself. And, that fourth trimester that I'm sure you know about, and just resting as much as possible. And rest nowadays in our modern society is just not appreciated whatsoever. We all trudge on, we take medications, not going to be ill, we're not going to rest. And rest in itself is very healing. It's very healing. Hydration, and just not panicking, I think, is just going into those spirals of doom, is what I call them, is easily done in those early days. But I think it's helped if you stay away from phones, social media, Google. Just be around people and things that make you happy. Get outside, all these things are definitely helpful. I'd like to make some shout outs actually for things that are
Please.
some little signposting, which I'm sure
Yeah.
you know them. So MASIP obviously are the charity for birth tears, and they set up around the same time I set the group up actually. The biggest thing I can take away from them is that their helpline, their 24-hour helpline, which I wish I had at the time. So that's really great. MASIC. Obviously, like Helen, my mum's doing jumps. She has amazing resources for prolapse. Caroline over in the US has just opened up the Solace Foundation, which is for severe tearing over there, and she's trying to help out our friends across the pond. For any maternity staff, NHS maternity staff listening, if you ever get hold of this podcast, the OAC2 project, if you look it up, that's a really great package to help reduce tearing in a healthcare environment in the maternity hospitals. And it's a really great thing to introduce to those units. It's something they can use that statistically does help reduce tears. And just to shout out some physios, I didn't know you know them, Claire Bourne Physio.
Yeah, she's amazing.
Yeah, Emma Physio Mum UK, and yeah, I just had some statistics. I've already said one of them about the birth tear occurrence, but 1 in 3 women have pelvic floor disorders. It's really common, and it's not a taboo. It's nothing to be scared of. We just have to get talking about it because we've got generations of women that haven't talked about it, don't we? And it is being talked about way more now, and I love that, because even when I went through all this 8 years ago, it wasn't. So we've come a long way in almost a decade, which is really good, really good.
And Rosie, please mention your Facebook group as well, so people can find that.
Oh yeah, so if you search birth tear support, it will come up, and you have to answer all 4 questions to get in. just because some people don't, but it's there to keep the group safe. Yeah.
And your Instagram account as well, if you're happy for people to reach out to you.
Yeah, so my work one's Rosie_naturopath. I also have a birth tear support one as well, which I'll be honest, I'm not that active on, but I do keep an eye on it for messages. And I'm always, my inbox is always open any time of day. I'm always telling people, I tell my friends that and they laugh at me. And I know, seriously, if you ever got a problem, just call me, send me a message. I'm always like to help people. We both do. We're in that industry, aren't we?
Yeah, but you definitely have. You've really helped. Thank you so much, Rosie, for taking the time and to having shared your stories so openly and honestly. I think it would have massively helped a lot of women listening. So thank you so much, Rosie. I'll put everything in the show notes, and it's been wonderful to talk to you.
Well, thank you for having me, Natalie, and good luck for next week. I'll be thinking of you.
Thank you.